Did you get that?
Yes, yes, yes. My father was real clear that he was black, and I was brought up to understand that it was okay to be black. South Africa owned it, but America's pathology is her denial. It is why we have to have the conversation. It is why we can never agree on what's going on, and it is why we are so angry and why some of us are so afraid. It is because of the denial that you cannot have unity without justice. You cannot have justice without the truth. You cannot tell the truth without courage, because the champions of God cannot win this war as cowards. Thank you.
Drum her in like we did back in the motherland. Brothers from the African Brotherhood, please.
Thank you so much. I want to always honor those who have given, and of course you, who have been my support through a war as it relates to this issue. I really do believe you have my back, and I will no doubt need you to have my back. So with that, I'd like to share with you just a piece. How many of you this is the first time you're hearing about post-traumatic slave syndrome? Okay. I know that a lot of information has been put out there about a lot of different things, but what I'm sharing is not really a new thing. It is something that we have known for a long time. That's why it resonates when I speak about it. It resonates in your heart. Before you understand any of the terms or the words, it resonates in your heart. When I speak to African Americans about this, it doesn't matter who they are or how old they are. It doesn't matter where they're from, what class level they have, whatever it is. They go, yes. Yes, that's true. Of course, when I talk to white people about it, they go, that's interesting. I don't know, that's interesting. But it is a legacy that we share. It is something that we know. It is something that's been strangely apparent, but made to be a secret. So what I basically did was I took a look at what was going on around me, and I began to question what I saw going on around me. So one of the things that I wanted to do is kind of start where I started. How did I get here, and why did I start looking at this in the first place? Where did it come from? Well, it started off with people asking about, diversity training. It's, again, something that the world began to realize it needed for some reason, some diversity training. But that really came out of another experience, and it came out of people that were coming to the United States that weren't happy with the way they were being treated. The first thing I started to realize, I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and I always say that I believe that does deserve an applause. And part of what happened to me when I grew up in Los Angeles is I grew up, really being exposed, not like New York, because you all have Ellis Island. You have people that came through Ellis Island. Well, not everybody came through Ellis Island. But you all had folks that came through Ellis Island, you know, and this was the place, you know, send us your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. But in LA, you know, you had folks, I was used to hearing lots of different languages and this sort of thing. And then I decided that I needed to move from Los Angeles. It was becoming too Hollywood, too material, and I didn't want my children to grow up in that. So I moved to Portland, which was a scary thing to do. Okay, because, you know, there was like, when I told people I was moving to Portland, they go, Joy, are there black people there? Are there black people in Portland? I said, yeah, well, there are 3 or 4 of us, you know, we get together occasionally. So, you know, I moved to Portland, and it was a very unusual experience, and I'll tell you why. It was unusual because, first of all, stuff was happening there that I had never experienced in my life, and the first thing that I experienced was something called the possum incident. The possum incident. Now, this was a thing that I'd never seen before. I had never really seen too many possums before, you know. But what occurred was some police officers, 2 police officers, decided to take a dead possum and throw it into the doorway of a local black restaurant as a joke, right? And so they were reprimanded, slapped on the hand, and given, you know, vacations with pay. For that, but I was like, my God, that sounds like something coming out of the antebellum South. That's outrageous, right? And the next incident that occurred wasn't so innocuous. It involved an off-duty security guard, an African-American man. He entered a 7-Eleven. Y'all have 7-Elevens here, right? Entered a 7-Eleven, and, you know, he was just getting some snacks for the kids. He wasn't on, you know, he was just basically minding his own business, but there was a robbery in progress. Right? So the clerk, who was a young white male, was horrified, terrified, frozen, in fact. And he motioned to him to hit the button so that the police would come, and he actually grabbed the gentleman that was robbing the store, another young white male, and had him holding him by the neck. So the young clerk had called the police. In moments, 4 police cars converge. They see this real big black man holding on to this white man in the front of the store. So they assume that the black man is the one who robbed the store, so they attacked him. The white man ran off and was never seen again. So what they did was, during this time, it was popular to use what was known as a carotid hold, which apparently stops oxygen to the brain, knocks you out. This is what they did to Stevenson. And the law says that if after 4 minutes you don't come to naturally, that you have to apply mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And of course, in 4 minutes, Stevenson did not come to, and he died that day. And so there was a huge outcry from the community, largely the African-American community, that said, you know, was demanding justice. And so what happened was mandatory training for all police officers in Portland. That was part of the settlement. And I was among the first to be a part of that training. 750 Portland police officers. And after training 750 Portland police officers, I knew there was no one I couldn't train. They had guns. And so one of the things that happened during that time is I realized that, you know, first of all, they came to get me. They found me to do the training. You know, I thought, gee, they must really like me. But what happened was the black man that they had hired quit. He quit. It was too intense, you know, for him. So, you know, they called me in, and I'm thinking, all right, I thought they liked me, but it was just by default that I got called in. So I started to take a closer look, and I wanted to look more specifically at why it is we seem to have this conversation about race. Matter of fact, you know, a lot of people don't want to have the conversation about race. They go, you know, I don't, you know, let's move on. There's, you know. So usually what happens to me is I start off workshops because I know that people enter this discussion at different levels. You know, it's like they'll ask me to do a training, and, you know, I want you to talk to all the people. And you got people that are coming in at varying levels of the discussion. You have people that are coming in at the level of, is there still racism, you think? Aren't we doing better now? You know, that's called Race Awareness 101, right? And I'm not mad at them. You know, I just don't teach that. I used to teach Race Relations 101. I don't teach it anymore. There's no time. But they show up. they're not bad, they need a prerequisite to be in my course. But they show up anyway, because after all, they're just not, how much more could I know than them? So they show up, and then you have the person that comes in and says, I want reparations, okay? And they're sitting next to each other. And I'm trying to keep everybody alive in that room, okay? So what I'm saying is, it is a difficult discussion because everyone arrives at a different level of understanding of the conversation. Now, people of color enter the room at the 600 level. Having attended no school, they entered this conversation at the 600 level. And so the difficulty is balancing that out. So I always start with a test question, just to get a temperature, just a temperature guide on where everybody is. So I ask people if they understand what racism is. So I'm going to ask this audience, do you understand what racism is? Show of hands. Okay. See, this is the professor in me. I can't help it. So I'm going to ask you this question. Can white people be racist? Show of hands. Okay. Can black people be racist? Show of hands. Excellent. Show of hands. Okay, thank you. Now what I want you to do is, we're going to basically do a little research. I want you to consider two columns. The first column is called white racism. And I want you to name some of the things that are representative of white racism. In other words, how does white racism adversely impact the lives of black people? What are some of those ways that white racism adversely impacts? Housing, education, jobs, health care, profiling as it relates to justice, criminal justice, right? Okay, so if I were to continue to ask you, we would have a nice little list there, okay? And that's okay. Now we're gonna move to the next category. How does black racism adversely impact the lives of white people? Let me get clear. I just want an answer as to how black racism adversely impacts the lives of white people as a group. Okay, here comes the problem, okay? Herein lies the problem. And I'll tell you the answer that I normally get, and I'm going to speak to that answer. They'll say fear. Now, I want you to stay there, because at first I didn't want to own that. But it's true. But we need to find out why the fear is there. But the reason why we couldn't fill in the other blanks is because racism implies power. I might hate somebody, white, and say, I hate you, white, whitey, whitey. It's not going to change you being able to get that loan. It's not going to impact your ability to get the home of your choice. It implies not an ability to just dislike a group, but the power to impact them with that dislike. So that's what racism implies. And yet, there were a fair number of hands that went up in this audience. And there's a part of that, now understand, we can be prejudiced. But to be racist means that you can take that prejudice and you can impact the lives of the whole group. And even when we look at fear, that doesn't happen to the whole group. So what I'm saying is that racism implies power, but the fact that that question ends up with different answers regardless of race says to me, we need to continue to have this discussion so that we can understand how we arrived at where we are and how it is that we don't understand that. So then I started to take a look at behaviors. I had an opportunity, as you all know, many of you know, to go to South Africa. My sister eventually moved to South Africa. And during that time, I was wanting to really get a feel for normalcy around blackness. And that's what South Africa gave me. was a sense of normalcy. But I went in 1994 to South Africa at a point when blood was still running in the streets of Johannesburg as a result of the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. That was a deep time in the country. And I knew that when I was getting ready to leave, that I was probably going to encounter some negativity. Okay, I figured there'd be a little negativity when I got to South Africa. You know, here I'm African American, and Mandela's the new president, and your folks might have been a little testy about that. So I was kind of prepared. Matter of fact, I'm gonna go on and say I had an attitude when I left. They always talk about how, we're always the ones that have the attitude, particularly black women. We got attitudes, we're aggressive, right? Intimidating, right? So I'm thinking to myself, I'm gonna go over there, but I'm preparing for people to, kind of have an attitude. A little chip on my shoulder. My husband was not happy with me going at that time, but I was traveling with 8 other African American women, so when we arrived, it was a tense time, and I was waiting to have that experience of someone, just anyone, saying something ugly or nasty to me. Just waiting. Yes, just anybody. And then after a few weeks of nothing, literally nothing happening, I started to provoke the people. How are you going to go to South Africa for 6 weeks and come back without, something deep to talk about, So I would go to white South Africans and I'd ask them, tell me a little bit about that apartheid. That was the something, huh? Nelson Mandela, and they would go, it's true. It's been, oh, joy. It's been an incredible experience, awful. The oppression of the blacks, the behavior of the whites. We're glad it's over now. Welcome to the new South Africa. So I'm going, okay, half a dozen people said that to me, right? I said, I know, I'm gonna ask the black South Africans what happened, okay? So I went to the black South Africa. I said, tell me a little bit about, end apartheid, new black president. Tell me, how has that been? Joy, it's been incredible, awful, the oppression of the blacks, the behavior of the whites. We're glad it's over, though. Welcome to the new South Africa. And I'm thinking, isn't anybody upset? And I did not find, in any of the countries in the southern region of Africa, I did not find what I expected to find. The tension, the anger, the frustrations. I didn't get any of that. As a matter of fact, I got more of that in the Portland airport than I did the entire time I was in South Africa. So then I began to ask a question, so what is it that I'm looking at as a social scientist? How could it be these people so close to this time when oppression was right on their necks? How could it be that they did not exemplify what I thought would have been an outrage? And then I realized that what had happened to South Africa was rather unique. It was very unique. South Africa had to own it because the whole world watched. Other nations stood up and said, this isn't okay what you're doing. So South Africa had to own it. They had to say, I'm sorry to the world for apartheid. They had to say, I'm sorry to the entire world. And they did. They owned it. They said, we did it. We're sorry. Please come back and bring your money. Okay? So South Africa owned it. But America's pathology is her denial. It is why we have to have the conversation. It is why we can never agree on what's going on. And it is why we are so angry and why some of us are so afraid. It is because of the denial. My family is from Louisiana, and I remember, and this is the strangest thing, because how you find out stuff about how to treat certain ailments. Now, I don't know why, did people just have more boils back in the day? Because I don't seem to see a lot of boils, but somehow folks talked about what you do with a boil. And I knew that very young. Everybody knows what you got to do if there's a boil. What you got to do with it? You got to lance that boil. Everybody knows. I haven't had the opportunity very often to lance a boil, but I do know that's what you do with it. And what we have is a big old nasty ugly boil. And we just go, well, I think if you put a little makeup on it, it's not really a boil. We start calling it something else. We won't lance the boil, but the healing can't happen until you lance the boil. And you can't heal what you don't see. And so what America has done is pretended that it wasn't there. And because they pretended and ignored it, it grew. It festered. And it is a monster today. It is why we have to continue to have this discussion, because we were never willing to look at it. So now what does the denial look like? That's a very important thing, because it's almost as though we are asleep. And one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to start looking at certain behaviors that I noticed that people would engage in. That to me was a real testimony as to our pathology around race. So those pathologies started to show up in a number of ways. One of the ways, and this is when you're in an environment of liberal people, liberal, open people that want to just really feel like we're all together, we are the world. And what they'll say to you, and this started to happen, and I know some of you in the audience have experienced this, where you are with very well-meaning, sincere white people who want you to know that they are not a racist, that they are open, and that they are liberal and accepting and inclusive. So they will say to you, I don't even notice race. I don't even notice it. And that's an interesting thing, because I've noticed in my life that there's two groups of people that tend to tell the truth, and the truth is an important thing. I think the reason why Malik Yousef's spoken word poem on Hollywood Jerome White is so impactful is because it's true. It's a true story. And I believe that truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtue. Without truthfulness, you cannot be healthy as a human being. So, are these people telling the truth when they say, I don't notice race? Well, there are two groups of people, if you ever want to test, that tend to tell the truth a lot. The first group are little children. The little ones, the little bitty ones. I would say 3, right around there. Because 3-year-olds have an opinion, you see. And your greatest fear is that they're going to meet up with some folks before you get in the room and give them their opinion on something. And they do. My daughter, and I hate to embarrass her in the room, but she entered a rather large room, not quite, maybe a third of this size. She got in there before me. And the people looked shocked out of their minds when I saw them. I couldn't imagine what she could have said. Well, that particular day, she decided she was going to let everyone know what kind of genitalia they had. And so she went about pointing to people and telling them what they had. And she probably, if she'd have seen a booger in her nose, she'd have pointed that out too. Okay? Because they'll tell you if you got a booger, Your friends won't tell you. Okay, they'll let you have that booger, but okay. The other group of people that tell the truth are our elders, the old folks. Because you see, you get to the point where you get old enough where you just really don't care what people think anymore. You're getting there, aren't you? I'm 47. I'm close. So you ask somebody, an older person, their opinion, and they'll tell you, you're stupid. That's your problem. You're stupid. So what would prompt then, anyone like that to tell an untruth? So we know that if we look at people are varying shades and hues and shapes and all that. So we know, in fact, that if I have a little towhead child here, now, the black people in the audience, you know what a towhead is? Okay, the white people in the audience, I checked with white people on the towhead. I got permission to use the term towhead because it seemed offensive growing up in South Central. I heard 2 ladies at the bus stop say, look at the little towhead. And I'm thinking, them's fighting words. I was here to back up, calling somebody's child a towhead. Well, it's the child that's blonde. The whole child is blonde. And it's the blonde that everybody wants to try to hope to get. That platinum blonde, the eyelashes are blonde, the eyebrows, the little hair on the arm, they look like a wisp of blondness. And it's striking. It's a very striking, when you see it, you're like, whoa. It's a very, very striking look. Now, you know who I'm talking about, right? You've seen these children. Imagine now next to that child, this towhead child, is a Japanese child. And next to the Japanese child is a Nigerian child. You think you might notice that there's a little difference there. Of course you notice it. These are God's choice of colors. How could you not? But what prompts white people to say they don't see race is the discomfort they feel with race. So rather than acknowledge that I see you, I'm going to erase you. And I wake up black every day. I look at myself, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with other people noticing I'm black. I'm not okay with being erased. It's not okay to erase me. But part of that has to do with what I call cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is when you have a certain amount of information or knowledge about a thing or yourself, and you are faced with conflicting behavior or information. It creates dissonance. Human beings cannot function with dissonance. They work to remove it. You have to remove the dissonance. Like I remember once at a workshop, I asked, I was talking about trying to explain what this meant to have cognitive dissonance. And I asked the audience, who in the audience smokes, but don't raise your hand. Because the woman started crying and stuff when I started telling her about the fact that anyone that smokes is insane. It requires a level of insanity to smoke in 2004. Now, we grew up with the little Winston cigarettes stuff with and the Camels and the Cools, which was designed to look cool and spell it both ways. So we were looking, you remember the Surgeon General warning? Yeah, barely can, because you had to take a magnifying glass to find it. And then when you did find it, it says, well, it might be possible that if, in fact, you did smoke, well, for some people, not many, but on some occasions, it could maybe a little bit hurt you, right? So, we didn't know, maybe. But now we live in 2004, and you can't even advertise for cigarettes anymore, but those that do, when they have a sign, it's a full third of the sign. The Surgeon General warning is you will die if you smoke. And if you happen to not catch that, then they'll show you on the American Cancer Association, a wheezing, ulcerating lung, And it just shows you this nasty, disgusting, sick lung, and then it'll say, don't smoke, right? So it's impossible in 2004 to not know the dangers of smoking, am I right? So now what we have to understand is what it takes to take the cigarette, light it, and get it to your mouth. And somewhere between lighting it and getting it to your mouth, you got to make that behavior okay, because it creates what? Cognitive dissonance. So you got to go, okay, no, I'm okay with this. This is going to be all right. I'm fine. No, I'm not going to die, not going to die, not going to die. And to do that, to engage in that kind of behavior, is a little nuts. Okay? So that's how far we will go as human beings. We have got to internalize a very different perspective of things. So when I began to look at this issue of race, it was much more convoluted than anyone would ever admit. So then I started to realize, and there were other, concepts of it. You all know, if you work and you're in any position, how many of you have be nice to the person of color day, some kind of thing? We get permission to be nice to people on, certain days, right? So then you'll try to plan for that day. And they'll say, well, I know, let's have an honoring diversity day. And they'll say, well, let's get Ming. Is Ming over there? Get Maria. She's a Mexican, isn't she? Yeah, get her. Yeah. Let's get White Horse. Get White Horse in here. And let's have a diversity committee. And let's plan something, why don't we? Let's plan a potluck, okay? And let's have a diversity theme. How about we have ethnic food? Maybe we can even have ethnic music. And, folks can come in ethnic garb, right? And now what you've done, I call that the fruit and festival approach to dealing with culture. And what you've done now is you've trivialized culture, right? You've trivialized it, because that's all you brought was a little music, a little food, you know, that kind of thing. So that's the one. Then there are numbers of things that we do that trivialize culture, that make it a non-essential. All of these, you see, are to me the symptoms of our pathology around race. They're pathologies. And so when we begin to look at those, we have to understand where do they come from. So very briefly, so that we can understand where we're going, we have to understand how it is that we behave the way we do and why we behave the way we do. Now, you know, far be it from me to start looking at stereotypes, because, you know, we know that's a bad word, to stereotype. But I'm just curious with you. Have you noticed that certain groups of people behave differently? I don't want to make up stuff, but have you noticed? I'm going to give you permission to know this, that people do behave differently. African Americans, we behave differently. Okay, I'm in the race. I know what I'm talking about. Okay, I want you to know, you look at Latinos, different. Asians, ooh, we different. White people, ooh, different. Right? And the thing is that we try to figure out how that is, what's okay to notice when folks are acting different. We don't even know, because we're trying to be politically correct, right? Well, I know some of you are familiar with Dr. Edwin Nichols. How many people are familiar with Ed? All right. Dr. Edwin Nichols, this is his work, and as a matter of fact, I wrote a model based on his work, The Philosophical Aspects of Cultural Difference. And I'm only going to hit on one theme, because his work deals with axiology, epistemology, worldview. It's just a long process, but I'm going to only just zero in on axiology. He starts by explaining that we arrive at our primary value systems as groups of people, cultural groups or ethnic groups, if you will, based on one basic principle, and that's a principle of survival, which has lots of layers to it. But he talks about that fundamentally being the foundation of what a group knows and believes. And that the European axiology or primary value system is member or man to the object. Highest value lies in the object or in the acquisition of the object. And that object began many thousands of years ago in North Central Europe. And that object had a lot to do with what they needed to survive. What might that object be? Food. Fundamental. 5,000 to 8,000 years ago in North Central Europe, you needed food. And there wasn't much of it. And so part of what they learned and what they had to contend with was living in an environment where it was very harsh, very cold, very short planting seasons. They were considered supreme deer hunter when they were deer around, and they worshiped trees. These are the things we know about what is known as barbaric Europe during that period of time. Now I want you to contrast that with the African and the Latino axiology, which is man to man, member to member. Highest value lies in the relationship between people. 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, tropical Africa, South America, how much time do you have to plant and grow your food? So what's the rush? We're not going to rush because we have plenty of time. We have plenty of time. Not only that, we have plenty of resources. If we run out of, roots, we'll fish. If we don't fish, we'll pick berries, but we'll get it done. And so we have a very different frame of reference and much of the focus. And of course, it had more to do than with food. It had more to do than just looking about and seeing what those physical resources was, but it had to do with what were the human resources necessary to survive. And those human resources were a collective, hence tribe, hence the notion of village. And so as African people, the primary value system that we had was one of being together. Now this is perfectly illustrated in something as simple as greeting. Every cultural group has its own greeting. How do Asians greet traditionally? They bow, right? When you begin to look at a very different thing, you look at European greeting. And European greeting, again, it's a reflection of their primary value systems. And their greetings is perfunctory. It's a perfunctory greeting. Hello, how are you? How do you do? How do you do what? My white friends are going, okay, Joy, you know, it was just a greeting. That's all it was. Say hello. Because it's perfunctory. It's not, you know, it's just a formality. You kind of got to do it. Okay, now when Africans and Latinos greet, it's ceremonial, is it not? Think about it. We greet in ways that I don't think anybody else on the planet greets. I'm going to test it out today. Sir, could you stand up over here on the end? This brother here, stand up. Stand on up. Come on, stand on up. Okay. Let's see. Let's find somebody over here that, this brother here in the gray. Could you stand up, please, sir? Yes, you. And could you come over and greet this man? Could you meet him halfway and go in and greet him? I just want you to greet him. What I'm trying to say, as you know, it can get into a snap and slap and all kind of stuff goes on, right? And Latinos will pick you up, kiss you, or slap you in the face, all kind of stuff goes on, right? Because the greeting is to establish the what? The relationship. Highest value lies in the relationship, right? So these are things that become very important, and it's something that has transferred beyond one generation. It's gone over generations. It's not like someone taught you that, really. You know, when you're walking down the street and you're in the grocery store and you go, you know, whenever I used to have my white friends with me, they go, Joy, you know so many people. How you know? I don't know them people, but I'm gonna greet them. You know, and greeting becomes something very important. And you think about it, even your children. You know, when you have children, can you come in the house and walk past Aunt Dolores? Not and live. Didn't you see Aunt Dolores? And then you got people, you try to not acknowledge somebody that you know when you're out. Oh, wait a minute. You too good to speak? You too good? You know, all kinds of stuff can go awry with that. Right? So greeting becomes very important. Now I want you to consider something else. I want you to consider what something like American chattel slavery did to the relationship. A people whose whole existence, fundamental to their survival, was their relationships. There was nothing that could have more devastated a group of people whose primary value system was the relationship than American chattel slavery. It destroyed and devastated relationships. One of the most horrific and vile things that could have occurred. So, I started to take a look at that impact on a group of people. It would have been different for any other group, but for African people, for American chattel to slavery to exist, devastated the very foundation of the existence of African culture. And this is something we need to know. And yet, still we rise. It's phenomenal that we have. So I decided to take a look at this thing, this injury. I wanted to understand it because the first thing I started to realize is that it morphed into something that no one seemed to acknowledge. Because whenever I talk about slavery, and I'll tell you, you get reactions when you say slavery, don't you? People, the first thing they want to do, is almost like the Million Man March. When the Million Man March happened, I'll never forget this. The first thing they did was found some black people to say it wasn't a good thing. Before it could be over with, they had people on television telling you how bad it was. And the first thing that happens when slavery comes out of the mouth of someone African or from African descent, well, that's all over now. That has nothing to do with, that's all over. First thing that happens, they want to shut you down immediately. And to me, that's the first indicator that I need to pay attention to it. So they say, well, you know, Joy, that was a long time ago. Slavery's over. Get over it. I wasn't even there. I didn't do it. I'm tired of being guilty about it. I didn't do it. I don't want to hear about it. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. And that's true. I wasn't there either. I didn't do it. But you've got to know that 246 years of official slavery guaranteed that the progeny of the South, the white progeny, would have wealth for generations to come. And that the black progeny of the slaves would incur a debt that we have yet to shake off. So it doesn't matter if either of us was there. If we were there or not, it doesn't matter, because the impact of that is present today. And that's the part that no one wants to talk about. That's the part that becomes uncomfortable to talk about. But we must talk about it if we are to lance the boil. So what I started to do is I started to try to understand it in the context of what I know people do. Now, a lot of people look at this, and it's not like, you know, there are many people that have discussed these things. But this is the first time we've ever discussed it on the level where we start telling the truth to the point where people start squirming. Because we got to tell the truth on this one. You know, how many of you are familiar with Dante's Inferno? Dante's Inferno is a story about a man who takes a trek through hell. And it was said that the hottest places in hell were reserved for those who were faced with a moral dilemma and decided to remain neutral. And what I understand about this issue is people desire to remain neutral. And we cannot any longer. Our children are dependent upon us telling the truth. So let's tell the truth about slavery. Because like most people, we look at it as Africans, and we have, and descendants of Africans, we have strange feelings about it. Yet there's something intrinsic in who we are that knows that it's true. So let's take a look at some of the things that we need to look at. We need to look at our history books. We need to first look at what most of you are familiar with out there, because everything speaks to this notion of race, and that we have had problems with it for a long time. So let's go to the Bible. And let's go to Numbers 12, if you want to know where it is. It's not obscure. In Numbers 12, verse 1, it says, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married." Moses had a black wife, and Miriam and Aaron didn't like it. It goes on to say that they kindled the wrath of God. God became angry and smite Miriam with leprosy because she didn't like Moses' black wife. And as much as I hear all the rhetoric about the problems that are existing within the African American community and anti-Semitism and all of that, nobody mentioned that Moses' wife was black, that we're probably cousins. How did we miss that one? I don't think Charlton Heston had a black wife when he did Moses. I looked. And if you're going to stay true to the story, it's not like it's obscure. Now, the only time I've ever seen it done truthfully, and I waited to see, was a full-length cartoon. And it wasn't Disney. Disney, well, that was too controversial, I guess, even in cartoon form. Wouldn't do it. It was a full-length cartoon. And indeed, I waited, and Moses' wife was black. Broad nose, thick hair. Even Moses was a little brown. Okay? Just a little brown. Of course, when he received the full revelation, he was completely white. Completely white. But I had to give him some props. Give him some props, Moses' wife. So what we understand is, in a biblical way, we have been struggling with this issue. We've been struggling with it, and we won't tell the truth about it. Then we understand that, at least for me and my family, when you really, I come from a family of people that, my father really taught us to express what we believe and what we felt, albeit respectfully, but say it in a way that, people understand that that's what you really feel. So we tend to speak kind of all at once, okay? You got to jump in there in my family, and you just got to get above the highest octave, whatever that is. And so when we get intense and we want to prove a point, we say to people, I know I'm right on this because I read it in a book, which presumably means it's what? It must be the truth. It's written in a book. And then if you can't find it in a book, then of course you have to up the ante, and then you move it up to, it's a scientific fact, what I'm saying to you here. Of course I'm right, it's scientific fact. So what I did was I went in fact to the literature, and I went to science, those two areas that we tend to worship in this country. And so when I looked at one of those heroes that we've made our literary heroes, is William Shakespeare. What did he have to say? Now, William Shakespeare was a reflection of his day. He talked about, in his plays, he talked about what he believed and what he saw. And one of the things that he did was he dealt with the idea of miscegenation. That's race mixing, right? Which is taboo. And I'm going to talk about why it's a taboo. Shakespeare often dealt with racial mixing, the miscegenation issue. In his first tragedy, Titus Andromachus, the black Moor Aaron had an illegitimate child by his white lover, Tamora. When the nurse first saw the child, she exclaimed, "A devil, a joyless, dismal, black, and sorrowful issue as loathsome as a toad among the fairest breeders of our time." In Love's Labor Lost, the king declares, "Black is the badge of hell, the hue of the dungeons, and the suit of night." And Macbeth curses his servant, saying, "The devil damn thee black." And of course, all of his tragedies, the worst of all was, of course, Othello, where predictably it ends in the destruction of both Desdemona and Othello, and it's packed full of negative imagery around blackness. So we need to begin to understand the etiology of how it is we've come to look at this blackness so negatively. Why is that so? These are God's choice of colors. How could it be? What does it mean? What does it create when you're dealing with someone that's not black? When you're dealing with someone, for example, that's white? So I went again to some literature, and I wanted to see, is this happening on a pervasive level? I want you to know something, that whenever people oppress another group of people, it doesn't matter who they are, women, people of color, it doesn't matter who the group is, they have to remove the cognitive dissonance. Because if you're a good person, you render yourself a good person. You say that I'm a fair person, I'm a moral person, I'm a spiritual person. I don't do things that are bad to people, like, hello, enslave them. I don't do things that are mean and horrific. So in order for me to feel good about myself, I have to remove the cognitive dissonance, and I do this by, number one, justifying my behavior to ease the mind. And I justify that behavior by relabeling the people. I give them another label, then I can feel okay about who I am. I want to read this, and I want you to know that this was taken out of a 4th grade textbook in Oregon. And it was taken off the shelf by a gentleman by the name of Daryl Milner, who's the head of Black Studies. Daryl Milner took this off of the shelf. But for years, in the late 80s, 85, he took it off the shelf. But nobody knew that there was anything wrong with it. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it, and we're going to see if you're going to catch it. Because he read it over and over again to the then social studies teachers who didn't notice there was anything wrong with it. And it remained for many years. It starts off by saying environment, and then in big letters, John Muir. Have you ever visited Mount Rainier, the Grand Canyon, the Petrified Forest, or Yosemite. These places are all national parks today, in part because of the work of one man, John Muir. In the 1800s, millions of people began living in parts of the United States where no one had ever lived before. To make their livings, people chopped down forests to have lumber for building and to clear land for farming. People put dams across rivers, they built roads, bridges, and railroads, and they dug mines. He read it over and over again. In the 1800s, millions of people began living in the parts of the United States where no one had ever lived before. Now, either Native Americans are not human beings, or they're simply not worthy of mention. Are you following me? They read it over and over again. Nothing's missing here. But what happened to the Native American child sitting in that classroom? And what are the possibilities that they would confront that inaccuracy? Again, the attempt to erase. But why would you want to erase this group of people? What dissonance does it produce for you? What have you done to them? I want you to stay with me there. I simply look at this as something that's trivial. I eliminate it, I erase it, because it creates what for me? Cognitive dissonance. We look at even the terms that are used in history, who the heroes are. We look at what they did. They would go in and slaughter people, but those were called victories. And when the Native Americans fought back, it was called massacres. So we have to understand the words that we use have a lot to do with how we perceive things, because words hurt, don't they? There's something about words that stay with us. And I want you to remember that as we move through. So then I had to take a look at these things, and I'm going, so Joy, what exactly are we talking about? So I went to school. I went and got first of all, I want to say I have a lot of degrees, but I don't particularly like school, okay? I ended up staying in there because I had difficulties with a lot of stuff. So I ended up with a lot of degrees because I was confused about a lot of stuff. But when I was going for my master's degree in clinical psychology, I was pursuing a PSY degree or a PhD in psychology. And I just figured out I didn't like psychology. I didn't like what it did to people. I didn't like the labels that it used, because psychology was born out of, I think, and psychiatry actually, the need to get paid. Come on. There's a book called the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, right? And if you bill insurance, you better have a code. So if you don't have a sickness, I'm going to give you one, because that's the only way I'm going to get paid. Now, surely there's something called mental illness. I wouldn't trivialize that. That's true. We do have a lot of mental illness. But I had a real problem with how people, quote, treated it. And one of the things that came up that my teachers would talk about, there was a couple of things, but one of the things they would talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's a long time ago, so I looked at post-traumatic stress disorder. I said, well, now, that seems pretty interesting. And the first thing I wanted to know about post-traumatic stress disorder is, well, who gets it? And what is this thing? Actually, post-traumatic stress disorder was born out of shell shock. How many of you are familiar with that term, shell shock? And shell shock is one of those things that happened, for lack of a better word, they didn't know what to call it, for veterans, people who were in war, that would come back and they'd have these behaviors because they were, looking at people getting killed and this sort of thing. So I wanted to see who they listed. And these are the folks they listed that apparently had traumas as a result of some major stressor. Identify groups. This is in that book called the DSM. Victims of rape, war veterans, heart attack victims. I'm going to talk about that one for a minute. Victims of natural disaster and victims of severe accidents. That's who's listed. And heart attack victims are often listed because when a person has a heart attack, their greatest fear is that the next one's going to do what? Right. So it creates a certain level of a stress. So they end up with So I said, well, where are the slaves? Seems to me slaves ought to be on here. And when I brought that to my professors, they said, oh, no, that was too long ago. Wait a minute. That couldn't work. I'm going, well, it just seems to me they ought to be there, right? So, I had a lot of problems in my program, For example, one of the things I asked them is, we studied Freud, Rogers, and everybody, all the theorists, all of whom were men, all of whom were white men, and most of their patients were white women, still are. So I started to look at that behavior, and I was questioning it. I said, now tell me this. I'm just curious, and I brought this up at one of those meetings where they had the faculty and the graduate students, and they wanted to have inclusion. So they wanted to help us get to a feeling of everyone being included. So I said, I have a question for you. I said, I want you to consider every single person that has been healed as a result of, psychotherapy and psychodynamic therapy and whatever theory you want, all of them, Adler, everybody, bring them in. I want you to consider everyone that says, I did this and then I was healed. And I want you to compare that number to the number of people on the planet that said, I had faith. I had a God and I knew it wasn't me. How many of them believe that that is what healed them? And there was a little hush, okay? And they were going, well, it's, can't measure that. I go, oh yeah, we can. We can measure that. Ask people, right? So I'm in the room with the people. I said, is it not a fact that there are more people that have been healed as a result of what they believe in their heart and their faith and prayer than what all of these combined theorists came up with? That's why I knew I had to go. I wasn't going to make it there very long because they didn't want to deal with that truth. They don't want to deal with that truth. Instead, you get in and they erase spirituality. Or they try to figure out how to package it and sell it. So then I asked this question about slaves. And they said it was too long ago. I said, well, why was it too long ago to diagnose? Well, because post-traumatic stress disorder only occurs over a period of time for a person that has experienced a trauma. I said, okay. So let's look at what happens. What are the kinds of things that people begin to behave like? This is what they would behave like if you have post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you all know in New York, because of 9/11. When 9/11 happened, the entire country was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. But not everybody had post-traumatic stress disorder based on those buildings coming down. And it was a tragic event, but not everybody was traumatized by that. Matter of fact, I would submit to you that there were folks traumatized long before that. But there was something that happened when people saw those objects crumble. And what those objects represented to America, what they were a symbol of, the World Trade Center. It wasn't just the lives that were lost. It was the symbol of what it meant. And that was wrapped in the notion of power and control and stability, all of those things, greatness. So many people experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people can't get on airplanes today, and they were nowhere near New York. So I understand that people experience that. Now let's see how they behave when they have been traumatized. Intense psychological stress and distress at the exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the trauma or the traumatic event. So I would imagine that if people, were walking around and they were around tall buildings or they saw airplanes going over, that this would trigger, are you following me? Physiological reactivity to exposure to the external or internal event. So again, you'd have a physical response. Marked diminished interest of participation in significant activities. This is a person no longer wants to do things. Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. Restricted range of affect, unable to have loving feelings. A sense of foreshortened future. Does not expect to have a career, marriage, children, or a normal lifespan. Difficulty falling or staying asleep. Irritability or outbursts of anger. Difficulty concentrating. Hypervigilance. Exaggerated startle response. These are the behaviors of an individual that's been traumatized. These are the symptoms that they are living with. So they go to a doctor and they try to get us some medications. And if you're poor and don't know about that, you self-medicate. So this is what people do. And I'm going, okay, that makes sense to me. Now let's see. Let's look at the diagnostic features of post-traumatic stress disorder. These are what the most common trauma involved. And so once again, I said to my professors, but are you saying that slaves didn't have this? They said, Joy, that was too long ago. I said, okay. So what I started to do, like I asked my audiences to do, let's take a look at what these features are, and you and I will determine if maybe some of the slaves had it. Because you know, they constantly tell us how happy we were during slavery. Even if you pick up any textbook in our schools, they'll show you happy slaves. Won't they? Nice little cabin, folks playing the banjo, happily eating pig entrails and watermelon, grateful for the master. Isn't that what they show us? Because we need to see those pictures, because we need to remove the what? The cognitive dissonance. We need to believe that the way we treated you was just like, and you was happy about it too. That's why those pictures are there. So I'm gonna give them that. All three of the slaves that were happy, and even the few that are still happy today. I'm gonna give you them. So now, let's look at this and let's determine if in fact, and the thing about the DSM, because you know you need to be able to get the money, right? So if a person is diagnosed with dysthymia, which is, you know, a kind of recurring depression, ongoing depression, chronic depression, you have, you know, you don't have to have all the features of depression, for example, to get that diagnosis. You only need a couple of them. Okay, maybe one you can get, you know. So I want you to bear in mind that you didn't have to have all of these to get the diagnosis. But I want you to tell me if you think outside of the three happy slaves, I want you to tell me if you think the rest of them might have experienced these. A serious threat to or a harm to one's life or physical integrity. They get that one. Threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or close relatives. Sudden destruction of one's home or community. Seeing another person injured, killed as a result of an accident or physical violence. Learning about a serious threat to a close friend, a relative kidnapped, tortured, or killed. Stressor is experienced with intense fear, terror, and helplessness. Disorder is considered to be more serious and will last longer when the stressor is of human design. That's 7 out of 7. You think they might have had it? Of course they did. And do you remember how I described exaggerated startle response, difficulty staying or falling asleep, outbursts of anger, exaggerated emotions is what we're talking about. A person that doesn't see a future for themselves. I want you to consider that person. And so everyone would agree that slaves had it. Did they treat the slaves when they had it? So during that time, did the master say, I notice you've been stressed lately. I'm thinking you need a little help. You think? No, they didn't get any help. And did they experience one trauma? Now understand that there were people that weren't there in New York when it occurred. They were somewhere in New Zealand watching it on TV, and they need to go to therapy behind it. So how is it we think that these people who lived a lifetime of trauma, that they did not suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder? So I think most would agree it doesn't take, you know, it's not even plausible to assume they didn't have it. That's plain foolish. That's called, it has face validity. So now we know they had it. And how long did slavery last? Okay, they had it over a duration, and then when mother had it, because that was mom and dad and aunt and everybody else who had it, raising Johnny, yes? So Johnny was dealing with someone that had difficulty staying or falling asleep, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future and doom. That was mama raising Johnny. And did Johnny get some traumas? And did little Mary get some traumas? And that's what they named us. So what I'm trying to say and what I began to do is not far-fetched. It's not some rugged emotionalism that I'm talking about here. This makes sense. It simply makes sense. So now that we know it makes sense that the slaves had it, they say, but you know, Joy, that was so long ago. Y'all been free. Y'all free now, ain't you? You're free. And what did freedom give us? So you have now all of these hundreds of years of slavery, hundreds of years of it. And then people will say, well, there's always been slavery, Joy. There's always been slavery. Matter of fact, you people enslaved. And there is, in fact, truth to that. People did have slaves, but not the kind of slavery that Americans had. Romans had slaves. I mean, almost every society had slaves, but not like America had slaves. Because American slavery, most people enslaved people of their own race, first of all. That's what happens. And that person was not considered less than human. Africans were considered less than human. They were considered de facto slaves because of the Aristotelian notion of a natural slave. The color of the skin raises the presumption of slavery, said Aristotle, which deems them fitted to slavery permanently. They will never, ever reach the bastions of normalcy as it relates to whiteness. They will never be fully human. 3/5. So what we have to understand is that the nature of American chattel slavery was unlike anything anywhere else, nor did anything else share in its duration. So we're talking about a real severe process. Now, how many of you are familiar with the Ma'afa? The Ma'afa is a key Swahili word that means the great suffering. You have a wonderful celebration of the acknowledgement of those on whose shoulders we stand, right here in your fair state. The St. Paul Community Baptist Church does a Ma'afa commemoration, and many others are doing it around the country now. And so what was the state of things during the Ma'afa? And that's the middle passage of slavery. You know, Malik Yusef has a poem he says, and he talks about how little kids try to describe the fact that we came over on a cruise. But on a cruise, you're not usually abused. So this was a real different kind of a cruise. So let's take a look at that. And there's a lot of argument around how many people died during the middle passage of slavery. The lowest figure documented with some level of accuracy is 9 million. That's the lowest one. And we don't tie a yellow ribbon on for them. We don't ever acknowledge them. When do you remember us acknowledging them? When? And they punished Spielberg when he tried to acknowledge it. So we need to understand that these were millions of men, women, and children that perished in the trip over. Millions. And we don't ever acknowledge them. Doesn't that seem odd to you? How could that be? We've not forgotten. We have not forgotten. But they have been erased mysteriously from the pages of history. They've been erased. And why do we erase people? To remove the what? The dissonance. Even during the filming of Amistad, the actors wept, not on cue because they couldn't help but weep. It got so they couldn't have white people chaining them. They had to bring in black people to do it because it was that unbearable. Spielberg knew. Why did he know? Because he didn't forget his Holocaust. He didn't. And you shouldn't. So what I began to realize is that this is morphed into a kind of lie that the annals of history, past or future, will never have seen. This is the biggest lie that has ever been told, as though it never occurred. How could we forget them? Millions. And what was the trip like? Well, you know that some of the cargo ships, they wanted to pack as many in as they could. They overbooked, if you will. And they did that for one reason. They did it because they needed to ensure that a certain number would go to market. It's like any other cargo you have. Some of it will spoil and perish. And so they had to figure that out. So they packed in, tons of people, rows of people, 18 inches apart, 18 inches surrounding them for sometimes months. 18 inches. Stay with me here. Stench-filled, rodents, feces. It's where they ate. It's where they slept. It's where they wept. It's where they urinated. It's where they defecated. It's where they vomited. And it's where they gave birth and where they died. In 18 inches of space. How could we forget that? But y'all are free. So when we begin to look at this, it's not a pretty picture, and I understand why people run from it. But my children need to know who paid for them. In my book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing, many people have said, Joy, where's the book? Where's the book? And one of the things that happened to me when I started to write the book is there was so much I needed to fold in those pages. So much. And the second process is, how do I market it? How do I sell it? How do I do all those things? And who's going to have the final call on what's going to go in it? That would be me. So I'm not getting ready to sell it to a publishing house and be raped with my injury. Can't happen. It just can't happen. So I'm self-publishing the book for those reasons. I want to read this because I think it speaks to the assault in a very, very good way. During slavery, so now we know what the trip over was like. Let's look at to understand that slavery is the antithesis of what it means to feel human. It is not a normal process for a human being to be in bondage for the rest of their lives. Period. When we discuss living enslaved, we are discussing only degrees of abuse. I have actually heard people attempt to justify slavery by arguing that many slaves didn't have it so bad. They claim some were even treated extremely well and were better off than people who were destitute and left to their own devices. Now, this has to do with poverty. You had something called Elizabethan poor laws. This is when Europeans, and if you really want to understand this, you have to understand what Europeans did to Europeans. And anyone that was poor was considered immoral, irreligious, and they were often imprisoned for being poor. And that's where you got something called able-bodied. If you were able-bodied, then you had no reason. If you had an able body, there was something called deserving poor, right? So there are obviously those who didn't deserve anything that were poor. I mean, the whole idea that these people were indentured to keep them spiritually okay. The notion was that this was spiritually important for these people. Poor people were irreligious people, is what was believed. And that's amazing when you consider religion and what we're supposed to do as religious people as it relates to the poor. All I can say is that these people are among the worst of hypocrites, for who among them would willingly give up their freedom under any conditions? Once again, let me be perfectly clear about this. Slavery by its very nature is abusive and abhorrent to the human spirit. It was no accident that the state of New Hampshire adopted as its motto, live free or die. Freedom means that much to all of us. It is detestable that constitutions were written and laws enacted to develop and maintain the institution of slavery. Slaves had not even the simplest of human rights. How many of you are familiar with the Casual Killing Act? Now, the Casual Killing Act was written so that if in the correcting of a slave, the slave was killed during that correction, it was not accounted a felony, but they were acquitted of all wrongdoing as if such act had never occurred. Casual Killing Act. Well, why would you have to beat a slave so badly? Well, you couldn't find them because they had no money. And if you jailed them, their labor was lost to you. So you beat them severely, and so severely sometimes you kill them. And do understand that women beat their slaves to death, many of them, not just the men. So I began to look at that, and I started to try to understand how much, because see, you know how when you tell a lie, you try to keep it going? And you forget what you lied about, you know, because it becomes a mess. So when we start trying to cover up this horrible deed, it gets more complex. We have to write constitutions and laws. So you have to ask yourself this question. There's a book called Southern Slavery and the Law. And this book is that book right over, big, thick book. All of that was about the laws that were created to maintain the institution of slavery. That's how complicated. Just same thing happened with apartheid. Part of what toppled apartheid was trying to maintain the separateness. It got insane. It became financially impossible. Too many toilets. Too many bathrooms. It got crazy. White, colored, you know, it got crazy. And to maintain the institution of slavery, you had to maintain laws, and you had to also calm the mind, did you not? So let's calm the mind. So the first thing we have to do is make everybody feel okay about this thing called slavery, right? So remember I told you we have to up the ante and go to science? So now we have to understand they created laws so that if you killed black people, you hadn't done anything wrong. Don't feel bad about that. Didn't you say we're just correcting him? Okay. You know, you can go home absolved of any wrongdoing because you were simply correcting him. There it is in the law. Are you following me? Okay, so now the law has protected me if I should kill him. So now let's just start kind of understanding how we have to now indoctrinate the country. We've got to indoctrinate everyone into this belief system, even you and I, friends. It had to come from somewhere. When I started walking around and hearing little children use as a way of cursing someone the color of their skin, you black, you nappy-headed, start thinking about it. Or when you start looking at and I want you to stay with me here because this gets real deep. When you start looking at people and how they get disciplined, you go to the South and start looking at how children get disciplined. Boy, go fetch me a few switches. I'm going to braid them together. I'm going to soak them in water. I'm going to have you pull your pants down, and I'm going to beat you. Does that sound like something that might have came from somewhere else? Think about it. And after a while, we begin to normalize that behavior, but you got to understand where it came from. That's a whip. And I'm going to make you go get it. I want you to begin to understand that we got to be careful about what we call cultural. We got to be careful about that. So now when we begin to look at that, truly, and the reason it's not an indictment, it's an understanding of how we've never been able to heal. Because through this whole process, first of all, you can't even talk about it. We can't even talk about it as though it didn't happen. 246 official years. And if you want to topple that and look a little further, it didn't end when it ended. So when we look at these behaviors, when in there, I always ask, because I'm sure that maybe someone in the audience knows some I don't know. Do you remember the free therapy? Anybody? Surely somebody here remembers the lines or something. Where the sign up was, you put your X and you can come get the therapy because we treated you really badly. You don't remember that? None of it ever happened, did it? That makes us an incredible people, doesn't it? I mean, really, when you start doing the math on this, it's amazing. It's amazing what we've been able to do. So let's look at what they did to calm the mind on a more pervasive level. So when you begin to look at the statutes, every state had its statute around casual killing and, how often you could, beat them and all whatever. But let's look at now, this is how it morphs into something else. This is when it becomes part of your consciousness, it slides on in there without you knowing it. Often I read this, but it's very important because it becomes the foundation of the scientific community's justification of slavery. Carl von Linnaeus, who lived 1707 to 1778, developed a taxonomic system based on a criterion of skin color and laid the basis for 19th century racial classification. Linnaeus properly began the science of anthropology. This gentleman is a father of anthropology. Although color classification of races dated back to the ancient Egyptians, anthropologists refer to Linnaeus' taxonomy in his Systema Naturae of 1735 as the first modern study of man. 1735. We're now trying to understand or categorize, classify human beings. And they'll say, although color classification dated back to the ancient Egyptians, I want you to pay attention to that. We go, why don't they want to ever attribute to Africa Egypt? Why don't they let us have Egypt? Because we do have it, Egypt. Why won't they let us have it? Because when we look at the knowledge base that was there, that emerged from there, the civilization that emerged from there, case in point, when I was going to go for my final exams in my psychology program, ultimately you have to take the Hippocratic Oath, okay? Now, when I first entered my physiology of the brain, neurophysiology class, I walked into the class, it was a big, thick book. If it fell on you, it'd kill you, right? It's a medical book, because this was a medical aspect of what I was to learn. And I'm thinking, Lord, all the people, big, thick glasses were sitting in the front, the class. And I'm thinking, I'm gonna have to take it twice, I'm sure. Certain of it, right? So I'm sitting in the class and I'm looking at the book, big, giant, thick book. And I open the front page. It's a glossy picture, and I'm looking at the front page, and I look around, I'm going, I can read what's on the front page, and no one else in the class could read what was on the first page of the book because it was written in hieroglyphics, and I can read basic hieroglyphics, and it said brain. And I'm like, whoa, it says brain in hieroglyphics on the front page of my neurophysiology book. I'm pretty excited. Now I'm thinking maybe I could take it once. So I opened the front page, and there is a glossy picture that was found in one of the tombs of the first ever recorded brain surgery. And they're showing you the drilling, the hole in, and the whole thing. And this is interesting because this is the front page. But when I graduate, I have to take what oath? The Hippocratic Oath. Because Hippocrates was what? The father of? I have a problem, don't you? Imhotep is the father of medicine. Not only that, it's no secret because you can't hide a pyramid, yes? He built the Giza step pyramids. So are we confused? I want you to understand how deep this stuff is. Then they'll go, well, now we got the first recorded brain surgery, which predates this man. Well, we're going to say that he's a father of modern medicine. Okay. Well, why are we still giving an oath to him. It becomes a thing where you have to question the psychology of it. And I'm saying they're showing me the truth and daring me to question it. Daring me to question it. I sat down and I know I had, when I mentioned this because it astounds me, this particular one. When I ask everyone to tell me the continents, and I don't care what you say about this, tell me how many continents there are. People tell me there's 7. But before we can tell somebody there's 7 continents, we've got to tell you what a continent is. They give you the definition: a large landmass, partly or completely surrounded by water. So we talk about Africa. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. North America, South America, you name them all. You start looking at, Antarctica, Australia. It's all making sense. Then you get to Europe. Europe is neither large nor surrounded by water. It's a peninsula. But wait, people look at that and go, you get children, they take a test, let them not put Europe on there. You've given them the rule, you've told them what it is a bald-faced lie, and we still do it. Then you decide to name a continent Eurasia. Why would you name the whole continent based on a peninsula? Even if you want to tag it on, why would you call it Eurasia? We did it. We looked at it, we read it, we understood the process of what defines it, and we wrote it down. That is how deeply ingrained the pathology is to remove the dissonance. And we can't give you Egypt, because if we give you Egypt, then we're going to give you a level of intellectual capacity that we have deemed you unfit to have. Okay, so I want you to understand the psychology that goes into this. It's not something, people look at it, they want to deny our kings and queens. They want to deny that it could be you. Because if I'm going to subjugate and oppress someone that I consider beneath me, how can we look at civilization so great and justify that behavior? You see, it starts messing with the math. So I'll just simply take it out of Africa. And we bought that too. No one stopped in the British Museum and said, excuse me, there's been a major error here. You can't take Egypt out of Africa. You got to put it back in there where the African stuff is. Nobody questioned it because it fed on our need to remove all of the guilt associated and all of the doubt associated with what was going on. So let's see what else he said. While Linnaeus advanced classification with the use of a color criterion, he also fixed on his 4 families of man certain moral and intellectual peculiarities that continued into the 19th century anthropological vocabulary. He described Homo Americanus, as reddish, choleric, obstinate, contented, and regulated by customs. That would be Native Americans. That would be the people we erased earlier. Homo europaeus, and I think white people ought to be bothered by this one. Homo europaeus as white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by laws. Homo asiaticus as sallow, grave, dignified, avaricious, and ruled by opinions. And Homo afer as black, phlegmatic, cunning, lazy, lustful, and governed by caprice. These insights into what Linnaeus defined as racial character, personality traits, behavior, intelligence, language, and a host of other related categories were transmitted into subsequent attempts at a science of classification and became more fixed than the races themselves. Not a shred of science here. Zippity-doo-dah, none. In a book. And the bottom line is you've heard these things attributed to us. Let's move in on that word lazy. We built the country. And what we didn't do, the Chinese did and the natives did. We are lazy. We fed your babies. You couldn't even do that. But the problem is not that it's a lie, but that we buy it. We will buy that about ourselves. When you go to right now the burial ground, what was so phenomenal about what I learned about that burial ground was how hard people worked. There were stress injuries. In other words, a man about 6'5" would have an injury that would cause the muscle to detach itself from the bone as a result of exertion. Who works so hard that the muscle detaches itself from the bone? No human being does that willingly, but you will if you have a gun trained on you. And then they turn around and call you lazy. And then we begin to buy that imagery. We begin to believe that imagery, friends, and for years and years of hearing it, we begin to believe it. Just like we began to believe Europe was a continent. So what I'm saying to you, that these things were calculated to ease the mind, to remove the dissonance. But what it creates, what does a secret create? It creates pathology. Secrets are those things that make us all sick. Secrets are what release the poison that creates the boil. And so what we have to understand about this is not so much what it did to others, but what did that do to us? What did we come to believe about who we are? I'll tell you, it's the reason why we all go, I heard that somebody got shot on New News. That wasn't nobody black, was it? Oh, tell me that wasn't, was he black? We start taking it on, right? Or we'll get in a room and we start having this discussion and someone white will get upset and someone black will stand up to protect them. Because we're so used to protecting white people from any discomfort. So when I began to look at the fear, I started to ask them, I said, what are you afraid of? And I had a white gentleman stand up in one of my classes and say, I'm afraid because I know that I have unearned privilege. And you ought to be mad about that. And so my assumption is that when you look at me, you see that. And that you might reflect that in maybe want to hurt me. And then, of course, everything I see on the news is that you are violent. For example, in the Rodney King riot, I remember looking at the statistics, based on what I understood about what was going on, and then what the news covered. The news made it a real black thing. 51% of the folks out on the street rioting were Latino. 51%. But it was a black thing. So we have to understand that and then I went further when I said about this fear thing. So I said, so let me get this right. You are afraid because you know you have unearned privilege. Yes, as a white male, I'm clear about that. I'm not proud of it. I'm not comfortable with it. And I sense agitation around that. I said, okay. I said, so now what do you think happens? Because when white people are afraid, folks get lynched. Okay, stuff gets real ugly when white people get afraid. So I really want to understand his answer. Because my son's life may stand in the balance of that answer. And what I came to understand, that when white people say in the audience, the one way that black people adversely impact the lives of white people is because we are afraid, then we have to understand what their solution to that is. And the solution is, you need to understand that I'm afraid of you because of my unearned privilege that you might be angry about, because I know you've been oppressed as a result of that privilege, but you need to take care of me so I can feel comfortable with it. So we all know what's going on, but I insist that you make me feel comfortable about my unearned privilege. Because that's what we're supposed to do, you see. Because then you wouldn't be afraid. So what I want to explain to you is that's how deep the pathology is. Oh my God, I'm feeling upset and a little guilty. There's got to be something wrong. What have you done? You need to stop. I think he needs to be removed from the room because I've become upset, because it is so unnatural an emotion for me to have, a discomfort. You need to be removed because you're making me uncomfortable. In other words, your presence and existence is a discomfort to me. Now, either you remove yourself or I will have you removed. That's the story. So let's move forward so that we can understand that, again, I didn't make it up, because it became now not only a part of the literature, it became the pictures. It became what we saw when we started to look at the minstrel shows. Remember the minstrel shows, what happened? All of the imagery that began to solidify those images of this shuffling, lazy, ignorant slave. To such a degree that we became embarrassed because we bought that the image was real. That's why we became ashamed of them. But we have to understand that nobody white looks at something someone else white does and takes all that on. They don't. He could be the president. And they'll tell you, well, he's a fool. I have nothing to do with me. I'm so embarrassed as a white person, they don't feel that. They go, there just goes another fool, if they happen to have that particular perspective of him. You see what I'm saying? But we take it on. Hence, anybody black, doesn't matter who they are, stands up and says something, we all buy it and own it and believe like we got to defend it. Somebody will ask me about, why did that black man have a tiger in his apartment? I go, what makes you think I know why he had a tiger in his apartment? Now, what's deep is some of us will try to answer that. That's outrageous. That's when we have to say, there's a fool. That's all that was, a fool. Don't have nothing to do with me. But we take it on because we have a collective injury, you see. And that's why when I talk about the transmission of post-traumatic slave syndrome, I tell you that it's transmitted. It's not enough to just deal with the family or the individual. You got to deal with the community because that's where it's reinforced, is it not? Here's where it is. So one of the things that I started to do, and understand that American chattel slavery ended, followed by peonage, unlawful selling of slaves into slavery, followed by black codes adopted by different states that says you can't come here even though you're free, north, south, east, west, don't matter, we don't want you. Sundown laws, right? Then we had convict lease laws where we arrested all of the beginning of, again, another fractioning, arresting all of these black men, principally, but not only black men, and imprisoning them with sentences that were, first of all, they were trumped up charges to begin with. And that's where overrepresentation started. Someone needs to do research on that alone to understand what was the impact of convict leasing on present day overrepresentation of African Americans in the criminal justice system. There is a direct link. I can't do all that research. But do you see what I'm saying? We need to do it because the link, it's a natural line. They said it worked then, it'll work now. The only thing we got to do is get them to buy it. So they show you criminality over and over again to the extent that we're afraid of us. To the point where we begin to think that we're violent, horrible people. And so then when the bill gets passed, we sign our people away. We do it. And they say, they did it. They did it. Do you see what I'm saying? We need to take a look at that. There's research that needs to be done there. I did some research on that, but I can't do all of it. So we have to begin to look at those behaviors and those kinds of things that produce this. So when I say that it moves from the individual, family, community, it's reinforced over and over again. We all never got in a room and talked about it, but we have the same wounds. When I was on Gil Noble's show, what I found out was we have the same stories. If I had an open mic today and put it right there in front, every one of you could get up and tell a story that we could all relate to, couldn't you? But let me tell you something. When white people hear us, they go, I think you're exaggerating. That person just probably had a bad day that day. It had nothing to do with your race. But what if they heard an audience full of people, 2004, say, yes, it did. And if you don't believe his story, let me tell you my story and her story and his story. We ain't making it up. This is not a figment of our imagination. It's alive and well and killing us today. That's real. So what does it look like transmitted from one group to the next? And this is an interesting dynamic because we do it It starts on the level of the individual, because I tell you about mama and daddy are broken during slavery. And let me tell you how that breaking process happened. Y'all know how Willie Lynch explained it. But I want to talk specifically what you do to dehumanize, to denigrate a people to the point where they learn to be helpless. Because you learn helplessness. And the way learned helplessness occurs is tests were done with animals, animal subjects, conditioned response. Skinner, Pavlov, these were people who started to look at conditioned response. And you know much of what has been said about how people were enslaved. Because Malcolm said that you take the chains off their ankles and you put it where? Put it on their minds. You don't ever have to worry about them, right? And I often give this analogy. This was amazing. My husband and I were up one night. We like to watch the Animal Planet. And we watch all those animals. I know everything about snakes, everything. It's interesting. And this one time I was in the other room and I was hearing, and there was one series where they said when good animals go bad or something. And you know, the little nice foo-foo starts attacking the family and stuff. And they had this one episode of an elephant. It was an African bull elephant in a circus that got done. He said, "You getting off of my back and all y'all getting up out of here." Okay. Elephant went wild, right? Running through, stomping people. You know, I'm done. And then they brought in a zoologist to explain the elephant's behavior. I swear to you, this is what he said. Well, you have to consider taken from its homeland, chained on a long journey, beaten, treated illy, separated, fed poorly, sick, and then under someone's whip constantly. It's expected that he would do what he did. And I came back out, I'm going, you can see it in an elephant. So it gets reinforced, and part of what happens if you tie an elephant, you know, matter of fact, if you knock a large animal down, they get blown out because nothing can knock them down, right? But if you can stop and chain an elephant, if you can stop it from moving against its will, and you're not an elephant, that elephant learns helplessness. They will chain, and now to this day, you can actually walk into different, where there are circuses, and they'll have zookeepers, and they'll have all these different people that'll be working with different areas of the animals, little circus folks. And you'll see the elephants standing next to the chains. Chain's not on the elephant, but it's so used to being chained, it won't move. Matter of fact, you can tie a thread around it, and it won't move, because it doesn't believe it can move. So learned helplessness is a process of, after a while, you hear it over and over again that you are dysfunctional, that you are backwards, that you are underachieving, and you're not making benchmarks. You are all of those things over again. You begin to believe it's true. That's what, in Wrightsville, Iowa, what Jane Elliott proved by Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes in the course of 2 weeks. Changed the scores permanently. The score was changed permanently academically for those children who believed they were on top and those that believed they were on the bottom. So what we have to understand is, I think probably, you know, the last 400 years has been one hell of a conditioning for us. And that self-hatred, I heard a brother say to me yesterday, we have to love ourselves enough so that we can outlove how much we hate ourselves. And so we have to get to a point where we understand how we came to do it. So how does it look? Let me give you this example because you all know about it. If you're in a bank, you're about my age. No, you got to be younger than me because I'm not going to be standing in line that long. But let's say you are in your 30s and you're looking at a woman or a man in their 30s and they have small children and their children are where in proximity to them in the bank? It's small children, 3, 4, 5-year-olds. They're actually really very close to you. Very close, so close, in fact, they're touching you sometimes, holding on to your leg. And as you move, they move, all in lockstep together, the whole crew. It's a very unusual sight, but we see it every day. And if the child, and again, I teach human development, and it's normal for children to move about and stray. That's how they learn. There's a certain thing called secure attachment. and insecure attachment. And a child that has secure attachment will wander about and talk to people and feel safe. But if our children move, get over here. You know, you'll see it, that little child, just a little bit to the right, child can't move. Well, I started to do the research, so I would ask, you know, the mother why that child don't need to be running around the bank. Okay. Meanwhile, same bank, white mother, 3, 4, 5-year-olds. Honey, come. Oh, no, don't leave that man. Put that down. Child is swinging on the little ropes and sliding down the aisles and running up and down and talking to you, annoying everybody in the bank. And the mother's just gently going, oh, no, run. You know, same bank. Other child, get your. Right? Now, there's something going on in that dynamic. One of the dynamics is that this mother is behaving this way, and everyone, you know, is watching. The little white kids are looking at the little black kids. There's two things going on. It's going both ways. The black kid is learning, oh, he can run, and she can run and play, but I'll get in trouble. And the white kid learns, they must not be able to run and play. I wonder why they got to stay over there. What's wrong with them? There are messages being sent, right? So now children are going to stay and be obedient to their parents. So when the mother, of course, or father gets to the bank teller, kids are lower than the counter. I've watched this. I'm not making this up. So the children will still try to explore because it is part of their task of human development to do so. So the child is going to try to escape. It's normal. Child's trying to escape. Mama can't see me. I'm sliding down the aisle. Underneath the little counter, mama doesn't notice. I'm almost free. Some other black people in the line step out the line. Right? They don't know the mother or the father or the children. They give the death stare. Right? So, little kid goes, oh, wow. Get back in line. No, nothing's exchanged. Now we're looking at not just the individual and the family. What is the other level of transmission? Now it's being reinforced on a community level. No words are exchanged. You see, because we've all taught each other that I got to have your back. And I appreciate that. But what we're doing is we are crippling our children. In so doing, not a word is transmitted. And that's why it can't happen when people say, well, Kenya, because they'd love for post-traumatic slave syndrome to end up in a book somewhere where they can bill it, right? They'd love for you to find a pill to fix it. But post-traumatic slave syndrome cannot be solved in that way because it also implies a need for justice. And that means that it's got to heal on all those levels. We have to not only take ownership of ourselves, but ownership of our communities, right? We have to learn that self-sufficiency. So it is something communicated on a variety of levels. And so as a result of that, we have to deal with it on a variety of levels. We've got to heal the individual, the family, and the community. So I'm going to cover one more thing. I want to talk specifically about the transmission psychologically. What happens to us and what human beings do when they are subject to dehumanization. I often say to people that when someone black has to go to someone white for help, what it does to them. Now it's interesting because, you know, we're free, right? But something happens when you're in a position where you know that the person on the other side that you're depending on to help you is a white person, isn't it? I don't care how liberal and open and spiritual you think you are. Something else occurs in that room 2004. If you're trying to get the loan, if you're trying to get the food stamps, whatever it is you're trying to get, the whole dynamic changes when that white person's on the other side, does it not? Right? Because even if there are no words, there's something psychically communicated in that room. And I try to explain to people what happens to a person that has to now go to someone that they distrust and have been taught to distrust for their survival in 2004. Because why should it resonate any particular way? I want to talk specifically about the connection between that dehumanization of men and women during slavery and what it did to our relationships with one another, black men and black women. It's such an important subject that if we don't begin this discussion, we are going to look at the total destruction of our families. We've got to have this discussion. And what we need to know is that we both, black men and black women, fight a war when we go out there. We're both in it and we're both injured by it. But what we have to resist is a temptation to punish each other for it, because that's what happens. That's what we do. I often talk about the story of my son and the little boy that looked at him and said, "What you're looking at, what you're staring at." I talk about that story of this little boy that has so much antipathy for himself that when my son looks at him, it feels threatening to him to such a degree he wants to beat him up. And how in Africa everyone says, "I see you," as a greeting. I talk about that because I saw the disparity and I saw the injury in young boys. Yesterday I heard a young man talk about that. He was about 14, 15 years old and talked about how he saw a young man in the street in Harlem and how just looking at this young man, he wanted to beat him up. He wanted to jump on him. And I didn't have enough time in the day to explain to him all that was going on in that young man, but I do understand what was going on in that young man. I understand why it is respect is so important for black people, because we've never been respected. I want you to know why we created words like Madea, Big Mama, Big Daddy, because they didn't call us Mr. and Sir. We created our own names to cling to a sense of nobility. Are you following me? Because we had no value, you see. So we created those terms and those terminologies. And even now some people go, they're ashamed and they get nervous when they hear someone say, "My dear," a big mama. Because I needed you to know that you were great. Because we weren't given titles. Those were only for white people, you see. So one of the things that we have to understand is what that dehumanization produced. So on a very fundamental level, we have to understand that women were subjugated on one level, men were subjugated on another. Women were subjugated to never trust their men, to only rely on the master. Now you understand, we never forgot, and we knew how to protect each other. How many of you saw Sankofa, the movie? Okay. You should see that. It's very good. And the discussion is important because in this movie, there is a situation that happens where there's two young slaves. A woman is about 8 months pregnant. And they don't want their baby born into slavery, so they're going to run away. Well, they're caught by the overseers. And so to make a lesson of them, they call all the slaves together, and they beat her. But they don't let just anybody beat her. They ask the black overseer to beat her. And he beats her to death. This is someone that was like his sister that he beats to death. And then the camera shot fades and you see that the woman, the medicine woman, goes in and she delivers that baby because the baby's almost turned. And so she takes that baby, and the next scene she's rocking the baby. And the man who beat the girl to death, now you know they all got to go back to living with each other. Are you following me? We all got to go back to the field side by side after you just beat this woman to death who was my wife and my sister. And we have to reconcile that. So he comes in, the man who beat the woman to death, and he goes, "The baby all right? That baby all right?" And the woman says, "The baby gonna be all right, but you can't come around for a while, okay? You can't come around." And I imagine what happens to him, right? Because they understand that he did what he had to do because the gun was trained on him. But you still can't come around for a while. Because we got to heal from what you did. How do you do such a thing? Emasculate him to the point where he beats someone to death that he loves. And then to have to look in the eyes of her parents, the people who loved her. And then to have to accept the love from them to you after having done such an act. What does it do to the human spirit? So what I started to look at is the psychology of the beatings and the rapes, because they were done very methodically. So when you take a woman out of a man's bed, that is his wife. You take him out of her bed, his bed, you take her out and you rape her. Not only do you rape her, you give her, pass her around to some of your friends and their children. And then you say to him before you leave, and she better be good or I'll beat you. I don't know that you can destroy a man any further than that. So she goes away and she comes back and she has two things she's got to do. She's got to take care of her and she's got to take care of him. And somewhere in his mind, he might wonder, did she enjoy that? Somewhere in his mind, he might think, couldn't you have fought him off? And deep down inside, he knows she couldn't. And then she looks over at him and thinks, why couldn't you protect me? Why couldn't you stop this from happening to me? And then in the second thought, she says, I don't want you to feel pain and guilt and disgust of me. And I don't want you to feel shame. So she soils herself again. And so what we have to understand is the psychology of that, because when they get up the next morning and they look at each other, they're not the same people anymore. And still they have to exist that way perpetually, not to mention their children are watching. So when I started to look at the psychology of that, the rape wasn't simply for the rape. It was to make certain that she was submissive and that she knew fully he could do nothing to protect her. Hence, he was always called a boy. That's why my father couldn't handle the term boy. You know, we hear people say, well, me and my boys. My father would turn over in his grave, somebody called him a boy, because he grew up in the South and he knew what that meant. It meant that you were continually confined to adolescence as a grown man. And so when you begin to look at the interaction, now you have 2004. You have a black man that walks into a social service office trying to get some mental health assistance. He happens to be bipolar. That means manic depressive. And he hasn't gotten his meds because he lost his job and he lost his medical coverage, and so he has no medication. So he's a little agitated, okay? He's a little upset, a little paranoid, but he's walked in here with Susie, who came from the suburbs, that got her degree fresh, who's been taught her whole life to be what? Afraid of him. Because what does he want to do to her? He wants to rape her. Now, if you all think I'm exaggerating, there's a book here called 100 Years of Lynching. If you look at the majority of the reasons why folks were lynched after the advent of slavery, it was because of a white woman. He scared her, he upset her, he startled her, he looked at her menacingly, he tripped over her. All of that could cost a black man his life. And so when we look at what has happened to our men, what must we remind each other of? And what happens to that black man that's on, he didn't have his medication, he's a little agitated. He about 6'9". He can't even fit in the chair, but he's trying to look smaller because he doesn't want to what? He doesn't want to upset or frighten her. But she is frightened, isn't she? She is frightened. So he's trying to figure out what he can do. Maybe I better not look at her directly. So I'm going to hold my head down. So in other words, I'm sick and I'm in pain, but I need to take care of you before you can take care of me. And that's what black people do 2004 with white people, and white people don't understand what's going on. It's a fact. It's a fact. So after you see the emasculation of the black man, the deterioration and the soiling of the black woman, how does that move through history? Well, I told you that they gave you those images over and over again. Because after the illusion of slavery and after the black codes and convict lease, then they said something else. They said, you know what? Separate but equal. Jim Crow, segregation. Y'all gonna be treated just as nice as everybody else. It's all gonna be equal. We just want you to be separate. And we said, hallelujah, that's a great thing. And you know, we did pretty well. And we did pretty well because we had to be what? Together. We were interdependent. We couldn't go nowhere else. So now we were dependent on each other. Guess what? We built beautiful towns. We had banks. We had everything we needed. We patronized one another's stores. We went to the same barbershop. We were the teachers, the doctors. We were everything. And then they looked over there and they said, you know, they're prospering. We thought the trauma was over. But was the trauma over? Oh no, they burnt those towns to the ground. And very often, what was the reason why it all started? Because of a white woman. Because somebody thought somebody did something to a white. It didn't matter. It was a trumped up charge, and it's in the minds of everyone. Because again, the preoccupation was always with sexuality. It's been there forever. From the moment black men came off the boat, white men were preoccupied with their penises. That's an absolute truth. Absolute truth. And the reason for that had to do with a lot of things, but if you consider the lynchings, what was the first thing to get cut off? Always. And that was sold and put on a mantelpiece. Right? So what we have to understand about this is that these are things that became part of our psyches. Black men, black women, white women. Because we became a reminder of our what? Our weakness. When black men look at black women, it's a reminder of failure. So show me something else. And what happened was during segregation, when we were booming and we were doing well, we could have healed. But we didn't get a chance to heal because they said, we need your money. We don't want you to give to each other. There's so many of you. We could benefit from you. And we would tell you, you know what? We know you have an ice maker, but white men's ice is colder. And we believed it. And we stopped patronizing each other's stores because we bought the notion that if it was white, it was better. And we watched our communities crumble. So when did the trauma stop? So then now we have integration, what we never fully integrated. Look around you. We didn't integrate. And so now when we look at that, we go, well, how can we reinforce, though, 2004, the images? You all remember the 70s, and the 60s, and the platform shoes, and you all remember Superfly, don't you? You know, coffee, you remember that. Sweet, sweet back. Black exploitation, no, we're going to sell you the image to you. And we bought that too, including all the fashions which they produced that said and reinforced that this is who you are. So they gained wealth as a result of our pathology about who we were. And they showed it to you over and over and over again. Because for white people, they can't feel the guilt. And the number one that comes out is, I don't want to feel the guilt, but you know what? Don't take my privilege. And so what we have to understand is we've got to take this chain from around us. We have to do it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is alive and well. And if we don't get with it and understand what it looks like between us, so now we have a man and a woman and we're integrated. Now we are up there trying to feel good. I look at, in my book, I talk about something called Never Let Them See You Sweat. And you begin to realize that what black people do to black people. You have somebody, I believe this on a spiritual level, by the way, the first example, the first sign of spiritual evolution and development is to delight in the success of your neighbor. Somebody black Now this is on a community level. They say, yeah, you know, they just bought a house over there. You know, that's an expensive area. They bought that house. Mm-hmm. They ain't gonna keep that house. The only reason why he got the house was because of his, you know what I'm saying? And I started to look at it. The young folks call it hating, right? But I'm telling you the truth. It's so pervasive that it's scary. And I want you to look at it from another level, not out there. I want you to look at it up close and personal. What goes on inside of you? And I want you to get with this on an honest level. You don't have to say it to anybody, but I want you to figure out what resonates inside your body when you hear the success of someone else. I started to pay attention to that. It's not jealousy. It's fear. And it's a fear of being abandoned. And it's what happens every single time. Matter of fact, they'll dog you out. And the moment you fall, they're going to pick you up and love you. Because I just didn't want you to leave me. That's really what it was. I want to love you right here. But when you leave me, when you advance, grow, develop, all that stuff, you're going to abandon me. And when you start looking at the superficial ties that had to happen, think about the fact that you have someone you love on a slave plantation. How attached are you going to be to them? Are you going to have to equip yourself emotionally if one day they're gone from you? How much of your heart are you going to let break? It makes sense that I can't love you too much because I have to be okay if you're gone. It's a duality of reality that no human being should have to deal with, but we're still dealing with it. Or those of us that don't want to be black, we know they're the ones that are Indian. All a sign of the self-hatred, the pathology. That ain't during slavery, isn't it? Isn't that right up? You know them, don't you? Oh, did I mention, yeah, I have a lot of Indian in me. I have people from, you know. So there's that sense. And what we have to understand about that is that pathology moves along. So what do we get reminded of? Now, 2004, you got two people, they went to school, they did the right stuff, they got the little degrees. They, you know, put the little down payment on the house. And all of a sudden, they're living paycheck to paycheck, like everybody else in America is. And they're looking at each other and saying, why can't you be this thing? Well, you know, because white people told us that, you know, now that we're all free, and now that we're all, you know, everything's equal, you should have the 2 cars in the garage and the whole little spread. White people don't have that. But we bought it, and guess who we punished when we couldn't have it? We punished each other. Because she looks at him and says, once again, why can't you protect me? Why can't you make my world safe for me? You're the man. And so he looks for someone that doesn't question that. And so we have to begin to understand that pathology of what we remind each other of, just like that little boy that saw my son and said, what you looking at? It's the same thing. We do it on an adult level. What you looking at, same thing. You think you all that. All of those things are symptoms of a feeling or a degree of dislike for oneself that is more destructive than a war. And it continues. The good hair, the bad hair, all of the things, it's all in the videos, the same stuff. It's over and over and over again. People want their children to pick someone else. They want out of the race. I don't want to look at this black face anymore. Because surely that is the biggest problem there is. Meanwhile, everybody in the world is running, trying to find tans. They're locking their hair. They're trying to manufacture booties. Getting collagen in the lips. Trying to figure out every kind of safe tan there could be. And until they say you're okay and you're beautiful, we don't believe we are. For some reason, J-Lo just gave us permission to have booties. Now it's okay to have one. And I mean that seriously. Those are the things that we have to look at that become part of our pathology, and our children are watching us. Okay? So one of the things that I try to do with the work is not to look at it from a purely philosophical level, but to say, what does it look like up close and personal with a black man and a black woman? I'm married to a black man. I love that black man. And I understand where he is fragile. And I understand what it means to be strong enough to say, I need you. Or I am afraid. And one of the things that we have to understand about what manhood is, because it took me a long time to understand how fragile we all are. Black women fight with their mouths. They fight verbally. No, that's the truth. That's the truth. We can back somebody up off us in a hot second. Right? And it's something that we had to equip ourselves with in order to survive. We would back the white women off. We would back the white men off. We'd back everybody off when we needed to. We knew how to do that. We could take them apart. And if it had to go to the next level, we could do that too. Right? So one of the things that happened though with that defense that we developed, that tongue, because I want you to think about this. And I talk often about those words that we say. You know? I know people in families that were treated, Oprah talked about not being treated well because of the color of her skin, knowing which child was favored over the other because they were fairer or whatever. We know what words do right now. The thing that you can bring it up in your body right now. Somebody said to you. It could have been 20 years ago, and it hurts right now. Words in some ways much worse than a sword, because a sword will cut you, but it'll heal. We can't heal from some of those words, and we can't get them back. So when you have a black mother saying to a black son, because she's raising him by herself, most of the time, because when he looks at her, she reminds him of his lack of manhood. And she says to her black son, you get your black ass in here and wash these dishes. Think about that. He's standing in front of his friends when you said that to him. And he loves you and he hates you all at once. But you're tired because you've been working 16 hours and the garbage is spilling over and the dishes are all over the place. I understand it. So how is it that we don't flee from each other? Because that's what we do. We flee from each other. But what we need to know is it okay for me to be vulnerable with you? Are you going to take this vulnerability that I give to you and are you going to beat me up with it? I need to know that it's going to be safe for me to say that I'm really worried about what's going on at work right now. But I don't think I can kiss any white people's behinds any longer. But I know that I am the man and I need to take care of you. Is it okay for me to tell you that? And I think that those are the things but we flee from each other. We flee from each other. And it's amazing. I look at black people as a salt of the earth. Salt of the earth. So post-traumatic slave syndrome is transmitted generationally. It can be healed generationally. It needs to be a community forum that says no longer, just like we give that death stare and we have everybody's back, we have to stop, like I have to stop sometimes, the children in the street and tell them what we believe and who we are. All of us need to do that. And when someone tells you, gosh, that girl is so bright, we don't want to say, yeah, that girl, but she's a mess. And she's so fast, too. No, we need to say, you know what? She is a gift to me. She's beautiful. Collectively, we need to do that. So the healing happens when we are willing to love ourselves beyond how much we've hated ourselves. We have to begin to use the right words, to say the right things, to believe it in our hearts, and to make it evident in our actions. This cannot be something that's lip service. It's not going to happen. White people aren't going to tell you. Matter of fact, they're going to tell you, oh, you don't need to hear any of this. They're going to say, oh, none of that's true. Just make enough money, you'll be fine. And I'll end with this. You know, one of the things, and I said this because Randall Robinson taught me a lot, because I know why Randall quit America. I know why Randall quit. I know that in order for us to understand that we all must be leaders, I need to know that my children are safe with you and that you will tell them the right things. You need to know that your children are safe with me. You need to know when they go to school that the black teacher isn't going to be the one that hurts them. Okay? You got to do that. You got to love our children through this. Randall said that one of the problems with our leadership is that we came as leaders to do good, but we stayed to do well. So we have to hold folks accountable. Hold them accountable. Everything that's black isn't black. And you know, sometimes we twist it. We're not right. And we cannot prop up folks that aren't right. That doesn't mean we destroy them. We just say, you know what, we're going to get you some therapy. We're going to work with you on that, but you can't stand up. You can't have a mic anymore. You can't have the mic. So we have to begin to become skilled and knowledgeable. When the book comes out, you all will read a lot about very practical things. You will learn history, those who don't read the history. Because I folded everything into the book, because I'm thinking if they only read this one book, I want them to get as much in this one book about the scholars, the knowledge that has preceded them. I needed to do that. And to understand that the healing begins with us. It begins today. Today. I'd actually like to end with a prayer today. Oh my God, unite the hearts of thy servants and reveal to them thy great purpose. May they follow thy commandments and abide in thy law. Help them, O God, in their endeavor and grant them strength to serve thee. O God, leave them not to themselves, but guide their steps by the light of thy knowledge and cheer their hearts by thy love. Verily, thou art their helper and their Lord.
I think it's a thought-provoking workshop. You get set in your ways and how you think, and it's enlightening to hear another side of the story.
It made me thirsty for a lot more. It opened my mind as well as far as dealing with different cultures, different types of people.
And that your ears open up, your heart open up, and you become conscious of everything around you, and especially other cultures.
What a moving experience. Whether you agree or disagree or are comfortable or uncomfortable with their message, you can't help but be touched by it and moved by it to a point of growth.
She's a very good instructor and a very good message deliverer.
Today we had our professional staff, our teachers, our social workers, our counselors throughout the city.
Now, my father died in a bottle. And on his dying bed, the very last words he had to say to me, the last words I would ever hear, he sought absolution from me. He was saying to me, Joy, tell me it was worth it to give up my manhood for you. Tell me that it was worth it. Make me feel whole. My father wasn't whole. He died not feeling whole because his manhood was robbed from him, and he wanted to believe it was worth it by looking at me. Now, that wasn't some many years ago. That was 1991.